On behalf of Pepperdine Libraries, thank you so much for hosting this event, for making this possible. And I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. As most of you know, Dr. Lisa Smith is an English professor here at Seaver. Her courses focus on gender and spirituality in early American text, expository and creative writing, and spiritual autobiography. The recipient of a Howard A. White Award for Teaching Excellence, Lisa enjoys developing new approaches to learning, such as using virtual reality to help students connect with important historical events, like George Whitefield, some of Whitefield's sermons, and analyzing comics in her comp classes. But Lisa is not content to rest on her teaching laurels. She's also a speaker and an active scholar, having published various essays, as well as authored 4 books. Hammer and Fire, Lessons on Spiritual Passion from the Writings and Life of George Whitefield. This was a 2024 publication from Square Halo Books. Also from Square Halo 2018, Godly Characters, Insights for Spiritual Passion from the Lives of 8 Women in the Bible. Lexington Books, 2012, The First Great Awakening in Colonial American Newspapers, A Shifting Story. And of course, the focus of our talk today. This is My Beloved, Embracing the Bridal Love of Jesus, published in December of 2024 by Wipf and Stock. But before she begins speaking to us about her book, I wanted to provide some quick context. She began this project during quarantine, and when she shared the idea with me in one of our many Zoom chats during that long season, my first thought was, this book should not work. Which I also shared with her. After all, finding the right reader, which she acknowledged was going to be tricky. She wanted a lay audience, but a lay audience knowledgeable on early American Christians, so that the reader could appreciate not only their writings on Jesus as the bridegroom, but also interpret these writings as a kind of guide for contemporary Christians. But the operative word here in my comment is should. Once Lisa began explaining the connections that she wanted to make, and more importantly, how she felt God calling her to this work, I too sensed that the book needed to and would be brought into the world. Moreover, during quarantine and into that Zoom year, she would send me each chapter for feedback. And as the manuscript developed, I found myself engaging with the project not only as an academic, but as a person of faith, someone increasingly curious about what the early Americans' understanding of Christ, which was so much more dynamic and complicated, and frankly, much more juicier than I had anticipated, what this had to teach me as a Christian centuries later. And so with that introduction, I'll let Lisa take it from here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much, Katie. Yes, she did say it probably wouldn't work. I actually didn't think it would work either, but it has made its way into the world. So maybe you can tell from this talk if we actually were both right in the long run. Anyway, I appreciated Katie's comments. I did drag in a second reader to help me out. She's a former Wave undergraduate work here, and also has done degrees in theology, in counseling, and just finished a doctoral degree in trauma therapy. Dr. Kristen Cummins is in our second row here. So both of them helped me a lot. Probably most of the mistakes are still mine, but we don't know. We don't know. Anyway, I appreciated them. I also appreciate Dr. Jonathan Koch from the English department, who was one of my endorsers, who received, this manuscript when Christmas is coming, finals are happening, there's also a fire all going on, and he was able to put it together for me. Also, thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to English 330. I totally know you guys would have come to support me even if I didn't make you. So, to you also, we're a team. Thank you. Thank you. And lastly, to Payson Library, really appreciate having the surfboard room. Appreciate Dr. Rusa, the dean of the libraries, and how he's always, he and his staff always encourage professors able to share their research and ideas. And also Jeff Bowen, you just took a picture of me, for his role in this. He always sets everything up, makes the tech work, that kind of thing. All right, well, let's get into it. I know some of you have 12 o'clock commitments. So what I'm planning to do is wrap up my comments around maybe 11:45 or so, leave 10 or so minutes for questions. So if you have to slip out at the 11:45 time for a 12 o'clock class or 11:50, just do that. And if you can stay and share some comments or questions, we'll wrap up the whole thing at 12 o'clock. And I think Dr. Hooten Wilson's taking us all to lunch. I believe that's what's happening. All right, well, anyway, that's the title. Forgotten Wisdom. As Dr. Fry mentioned, my last book was in the area that we sometimes call the public humanities. So I kind of got fired up a number of years ago about sharing what I did as an academic, which is by nature a very specialized field, sharing that for a broader audience. There were certain documents I could access. There were certain ideas that I was in conversation with. There were certain books that I had read that admittedly did a deep dive on a topic, but it was some of the topics I thought actually there might be other folks interested in that same topic. And if you've ever read a book by a specialist in any field, space, finance, something like that, you've appreciated their breadth of knowledge and their depth of knowledge if they can make it interesting to you and share kind of what can be helpful. So that was kind of how I've gone into my last few years of work here at Pepperdine in the writing side of things. My last book on George Whitefield was really similar. I looked at his life. He was an 18th century revivalist. I looked at his writings. I tried to figure out what I could bring to a reading audience, particularly to a Christian reading audience, what would encourage them. And then this book is really similar. When I was here last in the surfboard room about a year and a half ago talking about the Whitefield book, I shared from that viewpoint. How did I, as an academic, dig up, uncover, parse out, edit documents and ideas to share with a broader public? So that was kind of the approach I took with the Whitefield book. This book, I'm going to go a little bit different. I'm actually going to share sort of my personal journey. Dr. Fry was right. This book actually came out of a personal journey. It's the most personal of all four of my books. It even felt, I actually hesitated even thinking about, should I give a book talk at Pepperdine? Because it feels like such a personal journey that I'm sharing. But I thought it could be interesting, kind of pull the curtain back for students, other faculty know this, other folks who are interested in seeing how sometimes our jobs can affect us in a personal way. And what I found with this book was a lot of what I was reading and looking at and teaching in class actually began to impact me. And so this book is the product of that. So that's kind of where I'm going on this one. I'm going to share my personal journey on this topic and how this book came out of it. I'm going to say I have not researched why eggs are so expensive right now. I don't know. Somebody knows. Somebody's reading the Wall Street Journal or something can tell me. I actually thought of this example way before the egg crisis, but it's based on sort of how I came up with the title Forgotten Wisdom. I read an article in a magazine, probably just before COVID, about how 10 or 15 years ago, when the free-range chicken movement happened, where there was the idea of let's stop cooping up the chickens in little coops. Let's allow them to range around, act like normal chickens. They'll be healthier. The eggs will probably be better. It's much more humane. So let's give them some space, allow them to fraternize. Okay, sounded like a great idea. But when I read this article, it was making the point that the chickens started getting really sick and getting these diseases that they were, number one, sharing. So think preschool or freshman year of college. And it was, they were dying because the farmers didn't really know how to have free range chickens. They hadn't done it in so long. So the way they solved the problem was they went off to the local agricultural college. They pulled up some textbooks from the 1930s and 40s, and they not figured out, but they read, how do you manage free range chickens? How do you deal with the diseases? How do you farm in this new way? So the idea of forgotten wisdom, this type of wisdom is not that it's no longer wisdom. It's just that we don't need it anymore. So for 100 years, we didn't need that wisdom. But now such was our current situation that we had to kind of resurrect that and bring that back. So that was kind of my idea with this book. As Dr. Fry shared, it's a kind of obscure topic, one that isn't talked about all that much. When I shared the idea with my other friend, who shall remain nameless, but is sitting next to my husband, they were kind of like, this is a weird topic. I don't really understand why you want to pursue this. And so that was helpful for me to kind of think about how could I make this interesting for myself, but also appealing for others. Honestly, this book came out of some spiritual challenges I was having and that I knew that other Christians were having. As a practicing Christian, I take my relationship with the Lord very seriously. And there were things that were distressing me, confusing me, things like seeing leaders have, falls or do things that I thought were not really consistent with Christianity. That was hard for me. I was feeling my own struggles with staying passionate for the Lord over the decades, continuing to want to grow in my relationship with Jesus. And I wanted more always out of my relationship with him. As a Christian, I believe that the sort of the essence of Christianity is relationship with God. It's not just a bunch of rights and wrongs, things you should or shouldn't do. It's not just an abstract belief system, but it really is a relationship with a real person. And I always want that relationship to deepen, just like I want that with other human relationships that I have. So this was kind of where I was. And I felt like some of my friends were there too. And I was kind of like, what can help me where I am? Well, I started noticing things that I was teaching. I was teaching, as Dr. Fry mentioned, a class called Gender and Spirituality in Early American Literature. And even as I was teaching these texts, and a lot of them were not published, they were like letters, journal entries, people's spiritual narratives. As I was teaching them, I was reading things that struck me as interesting or different, but yet also kind of enticing. I'll explain some of these people later, but Dorothy Ripley, I am a free woman by the authority of our Lord Jesus Christ, who sends me where and when he pleases. May my pen testify God's unalterable goodness by a uniform life of holiness, crowned with the salvation of poor sinners, which are dear to me by the sprinkling blood of Jesus, my eternal bridegroom, whose interest I seek on earth, that we may be one forever. People like Sarah Jones. This is from her diary. Early arose and trimmed my lamp, went out and met the bridegroom. Infinite pleasures surrounded me, and my heart glowed with the vivifying flame. Boundless glories overwhelmed my soul. The newborn light was crowned with blessings bright, while Jesus drew the veil from his dear face and poured celestial beauty down in soft variety and melting charms divine, while I lifted up my voice and sang. Susanna Anthony. This is in a letter to a friend. Oh, that I could tell you, or rather that God would show you from whose hand this struggle is. Is it not from the hand of your God and Father, your Redeemer, Savior, head and husband? And has he not said you are as the apple of his eye, and will he hurt that? No, surely he will not. Edward Taylor, a poet in the 17th century, a meditation on Song of Songs, which is an Old Testament book in the Bible. I know not how to speak it is so good. Shall mortal and immortal marry? Nay, man marry God? God be a match for mud? The King of glory wed a worm, mere clay? This is the case. The wonder too in bliss. Thy maker is thy husband. Heardst thou this? John Winthrop, first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. We read him in 330. Told you it would pay off. Looking over, this is from a personal diary that he had that we didn't read. Looking over some letters of kindness that had passed between my first wife and me, and being thereby affected with the remembrance of that entire and sweet love that had been sometimes between us, God brought me by that occasion into such a heavenly meditation of the love between Christ and me as ravished my heart with unspeakable love. I thought my soul had as familiar and sensible society with him as my wife could have with the kindest husband. I desired no other happiness but to be embraced of him. I held nothing so dear that I was not willing to part with for him. And even good old Jonathan Edwards, we probably read him too in 330. And my mind was greatly engaged to spend my time in reading and meditating on Christ and the beauty and excellency of his person and the lovely way of salvation by free grace in him. Those words from Song of Songs 2:1 used to be abundantly with me. I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. The words seemed to me sweetly to represent the loveliness and beauty of Jesus Christ, to kindle up a sweet burning in my heart, an ardor of my soul that I know not how to express. I was teaching these documents, these texts. There was a lot in them, but I kept getting drawn to these passages. There was something that was enticing me. There was an immediacy in their relationship with Jesus. There was an intimacy. But one word that I kept kind of stumbling over was bridegroom. Obviously, we use the shortened version now, right? It's a man on his wedding day. We tend to say groom. I'm not exactly sure when that shifted. I know that the word bridegroom dates very far back, but I kept noticing that this seemed to be a lens through which these early American Christians understood Jesus. And that was not a lens that I had any familiarity with, really, or any understanding of. I knew in general that in the Bible, Jesus is presented as the bridegroom of the church. And so I knew that that was kind of a concept, but I wasn't really sure if it was important, what it was all about, but it enticed me. And so taking precious time, probably away from grading and lesson planning, I decided to do kind of my own deep dive into some of these writers. But I also wanted to add some other pieces to it. I started with the Bible. I really thought to myself, I know this is a concept in the Bible, but as a practicing Christian, that's the book that's important to me. That's my sacred text. So what does it say in there about Jesus as the bridegroom of the church? I started at the end and worked forward, starting in Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible and kind of presents what will happen at the end of time. Here's a passage from Revelation 19, near the end of the book. This is John the Apostle speaking. He was a follower of Jesus. He had this vision. Then I heard what sounded like a great multitude, like the roar of rushing waters and like loud peals of thunder, shouting, "Hallelujah, for our Lord God Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory. For the wedding of the Lamb has come, and the bride has made herself ready." Then the angel said to me, "Write this, blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb." And I thought, okay, if the whole story, according to Christianity, ends with a wedding, that's intriguing. Also in the New Testament, lots of writers mention the same concept. Here's John the Baptist. "You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Messiah, but am sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater. I must become less." To be honest, I had heard this verse a lot in church, but I had heard the first part and the last part, this passage. I had not really actually heard the middle very often. I was struck by that. Paul the Apostle, another writer in the New Testament, he had converted many people in Corinth through his ministry and his preaching, and he writes this to them: "Do bear with me, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ." And most of us know this verse from Ephesians. "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ in the church. Okay, end of the Bible, New Testament. I kept going. I'm like, let's see what's in the Old Testament. Actually, God speaks to the people of Israel with this language as well. He says, in this case, God speaking to Israel, "Fear not, for you will not be ashamed. Be not confounded, for you will not be disgraced. For you will forget the shame of your youth, and the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called." That's actually the verse that was quoted by Edward Taylor in his poem. One more from Hosea, God speaking again, "But then I will win her back once again. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her there. You will call me my husband instead of my master. I will make you my wife forever, showing you righteousness and justice, unfailing love and compassion, I will be faithful to you and make you mine, and you will finally know me as the Lord. Well, I appreciate it. All I was learning myself in class, all I was learning from the Bible. I also, though, lastly, wanted to look at kind of the witness of the church mothers and fathers, people who've studied this throughout time. Were there people in church history who felt like this was an important concept and who talked and wrote about it? Turned out there were a lot. I didn't read them all, but I was intrigued to see that it was a consistent theme that Christians really had understood and embraced for many centuries that was now missing in my life as an American Christian. Even more recently, from Pope John Paul II, in the church, every human being, male and female, is the bride, in that he or she accepts the gift of the love of Christ the Redeemer and seeks to respond to it with the gift of his or her own person. So this was kind of where my head was. I was reading all this stuff. I was finding it very intriguing. And a part of me thought it was super cool, and another part of me thought it was super weird. And I just hadn't heard other Christians talk about it. Here's a little passage from the introduction, kind of highlights some of the questions I had. And don't worry, we don't have too many more long block quotes on a slide. But whenever I contemplated Jesus as my bridegroom, a peculiar mix of emotions arose in me. On the one hand, I was a bit uncomfortable with the concept. As a wife, I had experience with human marriage, and I knew there were biblical passages presenting Jesus and the church in a marriage context, but to personally relate to Jesus in that way was totally unfamiliar. Was it important to view Jesus in that role? How should I even do it? Should I use different terms to address him or adopt different physical positions in prayer? Would he say different words to me, express different affections, require different acts of obedience? And honestly, would it feel a little weird to relate to him in that way? That was me on the one hand. On the other hand, it seemed like it could be kind of cool. Yet at the same time, the idea of sharing with Jesus the profound intimacy of a marriage relationship also evoked in me a real longing. In a healthy marriage, who is closer than a spouse? Who is more understanding, more intimate, more loving, more tender, more loyal? What would it be like to share that kind of relationship with Jesus, the lover of my soul? Isn't it possible it would be totally amazing? So I was kind of torn. I think what ultimately made me decide to look into it was it did seem like it was a very profound and consistent role and identity that Jesus adopted. And the fact that I really didn't know much about it or know how to work it into my own life ultimately made me decide to pursue it. Looking back, I suspect what I feared the most when considering Jesus in this role was the deep intimacy that is characteristic of the marriage relationship. After all, a bridegroom represents such intense relational realities as unequivocal exclusivity, profound closeness, fierce passion, and unwavering commitment. Lord, judge, shepherd, redeemer, roles such as these did not require me to connect with Jesus in such a familiar way, although of course he always seeks intimacy with us in every context. But bridegroom? Surely that connoted an entirely different level of relationship. So it was enough to propel me into searching this out. I didn't, though, really know where to start. Were there a few books on it? Maybe. Might my pastor know something about it? Maybe. For me, I ended up putting together three pieces that, as Dr. Fry shared, kind of ended up in the book. One was certainly early American Christians and their lives and writings. I was interested in their lives, the different things they did. Early America was very diverse. I was interested in what they wrote, particularly the things that weren't published, that I could dig in and find through different databases and things like that. I also wanted to look at the biblical narrative in Song of Songs. I'm an English teacher, so narrative appeals to me. Sometimes hearing someone's story gives insights that you don't get through, a nonfiction text. So there's a book in the Old Testament called Song of Songs, sometimes called Song of Solomon, where a bride and a bridegroom over 8 chapters kind of work out their relationship. And I thought, man, that could be interesting. A lot of the church fathers and mothers that I had up there wrote commentaries on that book because it was seen to kind of represent in some way the relationship of the individual Christian with Jesus as well as the church with Jesus. So I included that in my search. And then I actually wanted to try some new things. I'm a pretty practical person. If there's something that interests me, particularly in the spiritual life, I want to know what to do tomorrow when I wake up to make it a reality in my life. And so I wanted to try new things, knock around different ideas, that kind of stuff. It ended up being a 4-year journey. It was very personal. I did not ever think it would be a book, especially after Dr. Fry's lack of encouragement. She was honest, you have to be. But you know what? It happened. A book came out, and I just am excited about it, and I hope that it's a help to a lot of people. For the last 15 minutes or so, I just kind of want to work through what ended up impacting me from those 3 sources. Who were the writers and texts that I really found helpful? What were the ideas that I tried, the topics that I felt were important? And then who were the writers? Who were the people whose life stories impacted me? So I'm just going to kind of give you real briefly just an overview. Sometimes in a book talk, you like to do a deep dive into one chapter, but this book kind of develops and builds on each other. So I thought, in light of sharing my journey into this book, I would just kind of share the people who ultimately stood out to me and the text that did as well. As far as topics, I wanted really 2 kinds of topics. One, I wanted to know how to personally respond to Jesus as a bridegroom. I wanted to understand that, but I wanted it to impact my spiritual life. I'm very serious about my relationship with the Lord, and I really put time and effort into it. It means a lot to me. So I wanted to think about how I could relate to him and connect with him. So I examined topics around that, which I'll mention in a minute. But I also wanted this to impact me as a person in the world. I don't really want to just, sit in my desk chair at home or in my, church room and have an experience with Jesus. I want it to be brought to others, right? But we're all probably in that situation. We want to be a force for good to other people, and whatever we have inside us that can be a blessing from whatever source, we want to share that with others. So I really felt like, could I also think through ideas of how relating to Jesus in this way would help me be more impactful and effective in ministry and in caring for others. So that's kind of the main ideas that I went after. As far as the writers, I'll share a little bit about each one, but just to give you an idea, if you recognize any of these names, these were the 8 I landed on. Like I said, in a minute, I'll give you a little bit of background on them. But those were the 8 that I ended up landing on, mostly from the 17th and 18th century, creeping a little bit into the 19th, but mostly 17th century, 18th century in America, and a pretty good balance of men and women. I also look at John Winthrop in the conclusion. So it's, it's pretty evenly balanced. And I wanted to look at different kinds of texts. There's a lot of different writing in early America. A lot of it is kind of self-writing or life writing, where they're writing about themselves and what they're experiencing. But I didn't want to look at a lot of published sources. Some of them are published, but I also wanted to see what I could find about people's personal writings, because that's where they tended to talk about this topic. So that's what I tried to cobble together and send off to my readers and get their input. I'd like to just kind of share with you the specifics of what made it into the book and what ended up impacting me, and then we can move on to questions and comments. So in the responding to Jesus portion, I started with the question, how do I even start this way? What do I have to, what's the first step? What am I feeling about this? Where do I really sort of begin? And I started with what I'm going to call in the slide projection show, the bride's journey from Song of Songs. So I went to that Old Testament book and I worked my way through. And so each chapter actually has a section of that narrative that I connect to the topic. And honestly, she kind of started like me. She didn't really know in the story a lot about her bridegroom. And even more perhaps troubling, although I admitted it was true of me as well, she didn't really feel like, oh, of course he wants me. Let's find out how much. Like she wasn't really in that place. She was kind of like, I don't know, he's a king and I'm kind of a maiden and I'm not sure this is really going to work. And that's sort of how I felt around the whole topic. So I first of all felt comfortable. She was starting where I was starting. I really liked looking at Samson Occam. He was a Native American living in New England in the 1700s. He was converted through the First Great Awakening. If there's a book on George Whitefield and the First Great Awakening that you have access to, you should get that book. Life-changing. Anyway, Occam was converted during the First Great Awakening. He decides to become a minister. He goes to Boston, he studies for 4 years, becomes a minister, and ends up being really impactful, brings a lot of his skills as an orator to the pulpit. He travels in England with said George Whitefield to raise money for Dartmouth. At the end of his life, he really kind of pivoted and got much more involved in advocacy for Native American rights and worked often as a bridge between the white settlers and the indigenous peoples. His sermon intrigued me for a couple reasons. One was this idea of the beauty of Jesus. He talked about that in the sermon, and it seemed to me a trait that I didn't hear a lot of people talk about, but it seemed particularly connected with this bridegroom identity. Secondly, he really highlighted Jesus's relentless pursuit of us. The sermon is actually a sermon when a man is being hanged for murder, but he gives this great little word picture in the middle of the excerpt that I chose about how Jesus is like following you to the gallows, buddy. Think about him and how much he loves you. So I excerpted a few pages of this sermon. Thank you to the students who taught me that 20-page excerpt is not really what works. 8, maybe. Right, so readers, you can thank the students who gave me some good feedback on that just through life as a teacher. So that was my first question. My second question had to do with, is choice something that's important? In my own head, I really felt like true love requires a choice. We're not robots who are programmed to love God. We're humans who can decide to love him or not. Right? We all have that choice. But what really struck me when I was kind of researching for this book was how much Jesus wants to be wanted. I mean, we can get it if we think of ourselves, right? It's not that much fun to be in a relationship with someone who can take us or leave us. He really desires that passion in us and desires that choice. So that was kind of intriguing for me. Again, the bride, she has her own journey. She's like, yeah, no, I don't really have time for this. That's how she kicks it off. So I was like, okay, I get this girl. Hopefully she'll pull herself back up and, get on from there. But yeah, she starts off with saying no. And I did include a little bit of poetry in the book. Edward Taylor, he was a Puritan minister, had a tough time in England. He refused. Well, he knows about choice, is how he landed here. He refused to choose to sign certain acts that would allow him to have more access to jobs and education and things in England because of his religious commitments. And so he had to come to America to find a job, get a college education, all of that. He ended up working as a minister, I think in Massachusetts, but he knew about choice because his choices had really cost him. So I looked at some of his poems. He was very taken with Song of Solomon, preached whole series of sermons on it, and would write poems before he preached the sermons or before his church took the Lord's Supper. I also thought, this is going to take some time and effort. We're stuck in the house with COVID. But beyond that, even, how do I really motivate myself? That was part of what I kind of wondered about. And how do I motivate myself through the times when I don't feel Jesus's presence? This is a new area for me to understand him. I can already guess that I'm going to hit obstacles and I'm going to need to try to push past them. How am I going to persevere in this, especially in the times when I don't really feel anything? And again, the bride helped me with this. She was, after her initial rejection, that kind of galvanized her in the story. She was willing to go to new places to search him out. She was willing to be very persistent. When you read the story, she's like, I'm going to do this. She goes after it. She's very grateful when she finds him. So looking at her turn from, I don't think this is for me, to actually, I want this and I'm going to have to make this happen, helped me with the idea of pursuing Jesus in this new way and kind of encouraged me. Old Jonathan Edwards made an appearance. Probably the best known writer from this time, a minister. He kept his own spiritual narrative kind of his diary of his experiences. And he also wrote a published treatise on the role of the emotions in the spiritual life. I felt like that was something that can sometimes be misunderstood. I literally just yesterday read a blog post that talked about how certain sects of Christians only go by their emotions and don't bring their brain into their spirituality. And I'm like, okay, maybe they do, but I feel like sometimes we have a knee-jerk reaction against emotions and we don't know how to, a healthy way to incorporate them as human beings into our relationship with God. So I look at that a little bit in this chapter. Lastly, I wanted to think about the idea of encounter. Could I do this whole journey in my head, or was it important that I set time aside and think about an actual encounter or experience with Jesus? And if you're a spiritual person, you know what those times can be like. You know it can really be motivating and encouraging when you have an encounter with God. So again, I looked at the bride. She showed me how to give Jesus my full attention. Can you maintain a spiritual life by listening to worship music in the car and listening to podcasts on the treadmill? I mean, maybe. I've made a go of it for a while like that. But I learned from her that if this was a topic that I wanted to really understand, if I wanted to connect with Jesus in this way, I did have to actually give it some focused attention, actually think about it. And also, I had to be willing to let Jesus disrupt things a little bit. I called it productive disruption in the book. It sounds worse than it is. No, actually, I think it is worse than it sounds. Anyone in here who has tried to make a hardcore change, right? Health change, how you interact in relationships, maybe even academic change. Sometimes things need to get shaken up a little and disrupted for new things to happen. And that's where I really realized that the bride is willing to do that. She actually talks about her garden and she's like, let the wind blow, let it come on in and disrupt the garden. I want some changes. Sarah Edwards was Jonathan Edwards' wife, and she was a spiritual leader in her church. She had a crazy 2-week encounter. If you take my Great Awakening class, you'll learn all about it. She had a crazy 2-week encounter with God where basically she had to lie in bed. She was just hit so powerfully by God. Look at this passage from what she wrote. She explained it in her 2-week encounter. So far as I am capable of making a comparison, I think that what I felt each minute during the continuance of the whole encounter, this was one night when she was sleeping, was worth more than all the outward comfort and pleasure which I had enjoyed in my whole life put together. This is not a girl given to exaggeration, I can tell you that right now. But that kind of statement, I was like, wow, encounter matters. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, ecstasy doesn't last, but it cuts a channel for something lasting. And we all know, either spiritually or even in human relationships or surfing or whatever that has your heart kind of captivated right now, when you have a really amazing experience or encounter, it can motivate you and move you forward for a long time, even if the encounter doesn't last 2 years. So those were kind of the ideas and the people that came into my life and their writings that came into my life when I was thinking of responding to Jesus. I'm coming to my last 5 or so minutes here. Hang with me. I also wanted to think about how I would impact others, right? So this idea of interceding for others, how would my new connection with Jesus help me in praying for others? Again, I looked to the bride. She rejects him again, gosh darn it. Someone needs to make a feature film of this book. They probably did, because there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of moments of tension and suspense. Yeah, she's like, you know what? We came super far. I think that's far enough. You know, let's not push it, okay? She does it, but again, she comes back around. And two of the things I noticed in the story is she releases control and she shifts her focus. And that helps when she's, in my case, at least for prayer, when I'm trying to care for others through prayer, when I'm trying to think about their needs. Can I release control to God? Can I shift focus onto God? Dorothy Ripley, that girl's radical. She's in England. She has an intense experience with God, feels called to America to preach against slavery. She's a young woman, doesn't have a job. I don't know, no credit card as far as I can tell. Hops on a boat from England, says, bye, mom, bye, sister. I'm going to go do God's work. He'll take care of me. Comes to the States and travels up and down the eastern seaboard, preaching that slavery is wrong, praying for slaves. A lot of her journal is about her own personal burden and how upset she is and how she's kind of carrying this burden. She spoke to Thomas Jefferson one-on-one about him being a slaveholder. She spoke to, I don't think Congress, but she spoke at the US Capitol. Some people. So she had this real kind of fire. In the book, I call it next level prayer. She had the burden. That's what drove her. And she talks a lot about Jesus through this bridegroom lens, but it also drove her to put feet to her prayers, so to speak. I also wanted to think about the idea of encouragement. I'm a kind of person, and I know a lot of you are like this. I want people to feel better about themselves in life after they've been with me than worse. I don't know how often I accomplish that. Students, it doesn't count because in the classroom, that's a hard venue. But I was like, how can I encourage others more? I thought maybe it might have to do with learning to receive Jesus's encouragement from me, particularly in that close, intimate bridal context. Might that make me a more encouraging person if I feel how much he loves me, how much he cares for me? The bride, of course, goes after this as well. We're in almost the last chapter of the book, and she's changing. She writes, come, my beloved, let us go out into the fields and lodge in the villages. Let us go out early to the vineyards and see whether the vines have budded, whether the grape blossoms have opened, and the pomegranates are in bloom. So she's now turning her focus outward. Sarah Osborne and Susanna Anthony were good friends for like 50 years. They lived in Rhode Island, totally different. Sarah Osborne had like 10 groups of people a week cycling through her house to hear her comments on the sermon, to pray, whatever. Susanna Anthony felt a call to prayer. She had her little prayer room, kept her little journal of what God was leading her to pray for. But they were great friends. They encouraged each other, so I looked at their letters. Last two chapters, I thought about the question of how do I minister to Jesus? This to me seemed like maybe the most unexpected part of what I was experiencing when I was thinking of how to minister to others. There's actually a long history of people ministering to Jesus. So David left Asaph and his brothers there before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to minister regularly before the Ark as each day required. David had like a couple thousand people who were supposed to worship God, honor God, sacrifice to God in the temple. We, of course, are priests today. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Even in heaven, we're going to do this. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him night and day in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. So the idea of offering God our love, offering God our ministry. This was a concept I began to associate with Jesus as the bridegroom. The bride does it. She learns about being vulnerable. She learns about being open in her relationship with the Lord. Sorry, I'm down the bottom of the slide there. And Sarah Jones was a Methodist leader. Frances Asbury actually came to her funeral and spoke about her. She spent chunks of time, hours and hours, ministering unto Jesus. And I found that concept really interesting. So that's probably my favorite chapter in the book. Back me up, Dr. Fry. Yeah, best one. Dr. Coven. Yeah. All right, last chapter. And then we'll wrap it up. What spiritual authority do I have as Jesus's bride? Again, what's going to change in me that will help me feel more confident in blessing and loving others? The bride has this. She actually says, this is the last chapter, but now I have grown and become a bride, and my love for him has made me a tower of passion and contentment for my beloved. I am now a firm wall of protection for others, guarding them from harm. This is how he sees me. I am the one who brings him bliss, finding favor in his eyes. I saw strength, fruitfulness, confidence in the bride. I saw her taking the initiative, and I really enjoyed the story and writings of Julia A.J. Foote. She was born of formerly enslaved parents in New York. She felt a call, had honestly like a bridegroom experience with Jesus around that passage in Isaiah that I read, your maker's your husband. felt called to be a traveling evangelist. Everybody told her no. They're like, you're a woman of color, and you're a little too much. Was basically what they told her. Even her own pastor, he's like, I give it 3 months. I mean, that was that. She didn't care. I mean, okay, this is before the Civil War, okay? So she pushed through everything, really had this sense of authority that I thought was just great. So anyway, these are the pieces that I thought would help me with these spiritual challenges that I had, that I saw other people having. These are the pieces that are included in each chapter of the book. Each chapter has a topic. Each chapter has a little bit about the life of a writer.